I'll snap my fingers to get them synced. So maybe should I do the intro now, or should I do the intro as a separate thing?
Do one now, and if you don't like it, do another one later.
I think everybody who watches my channel will already know who Geoff is, but in case there are a few stragglers who don't, this is Dr Geoff Lindsey, who I became aware of when I read English After RP, which was a book that you released in, was it 2019? 2019. I think that's exactly how the video started last time, with me not knowing what year it had come out. We did a video together a couple of years ago and have met several times since and sort of become friends, I would say. Hopefully that's not too... if you just disagreed there.
I wouldn't go that far.
And yeah, I'm not sure I'd say friends. But
oops.
Oh, is that your glasses?
Yeah, don't worry. I'll get them.
But in the meantime, Geoff's videos have gained well-deserved recognition.
Oh yeah, I was a nobody when the first time.
I wouldn't say you weren't a nobody, but they sort of shot up. Was it 2 years ago, maybe three?
I think it was. Yeah, it was the end of 2022. I think it wasn't that long after we did the interview, was it?
Maybe not.
A few months
within
later.
a few months, yeah, because it was cold when we did the interview. I remember. But
yeah, I remember feeling very in awe of being interviewed by a major YouTuber.
This is the thing, you see. I feel like I always, whenever I'm talking to someone who's very qualified and has a long academic career, I always think they must look at me as some kind of grifter who's grifted my way into being semi-respected in a subject I don't have formal qualifications in. So I always think, is this, not that I ever thought that you thought that, but I always worry that the perception is, obviously the person who's actually researched it for years and years should be the one that has a platform rather than some.
No, I have masses and masses of imposter syndrome. And every time I see one of your new videos, I go, oh my goodness, that's something else he knows about that I don't know anything about.
I just go on a lot of little rabbit holes. It's got harder since I haven't had a university login, although I think there might be a way of getting it through UCL as alumni. But yeah, I think I just like diving into. But then it's hard to know whether you've read a good summary of a given topic, for example. So if I start talking about phonology, I deliberately didn't talk about it with John because I know that I would have made the stupidest mistake and outed myself as somebody who doesn't know the basic things about phonology that I would have learned if I'd had a specific undergrad degree in it. And
that's kind of how I've always felt about phonology, because when I was an undergraduate, we didn't really have a specialist phonologist.
Right.
In fact, John, who arrived to work at UCL the same time I arrived to work at UCL, was the phonologist that they finally appointed.
Right.
So I'd previously been a student at UCL, and that was a gap, you see. So
yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny because the more I've got into it, the more I've realised how, I think it's natural to realise as you get into an academic field how specialised most people are, and how they might have a hole in their knowledge, that if you're outside the field you might think, that guy's an archaeologist, for example, he must know everything about ancient Egypt, which is obviously not true. The average person who's a bit interested in ancient Egypt might know things that this.
I think for most people, it's mostly whole, right?
yeah. That's the
With
thing.
just islands of knowledge.
And I think I always thought of, because the more you get into either phonology or phonetics, the more you, as a student, the more you realise that they're different. They're different things. But yeah, I felt gradually better and better about my lack of knowledge of phonology as I've gone along. I've realised that just being very interested in phonetics is perfectly okay.
I think the fear of not knowing enough, I don't know how much I can generalise to other people, but that's decreased an awful lot in my case. And it's not you know, it's not exactly proportional to how much more I know.
Yeah,
It's it's something to do with aging. And I was just having an email correspondence with somebody closer to your age, who's obviously quite sort of somewhat distressed at what he thinks he doesn't know.
Right.
And I can remember feeling exactly the same way, of being very, very defensive, very worried.
Yeah.
About, you know, in particular, you know, missing important things, important gaps, fundamental gaps. What I'm going to show, you know, that I have this terrible, terrible gap in my knowledge. And, you know, I do know a bit more than I used to. I'm probably forgetting stuff as well at the same time. But, yeah, somehow, I mean, I'm, you know, anxious about all kinds of things still, but I'm anxious about new things. But that anxiety about not knowing enough or revealing yourself not to know something is less now.
Yeah, I think I'm finding that.
Because the more, you know, there's that, you know, saying that the more you know, the more you realise you don't know.
Yeah,
it's true.
Is it the Dunning-Kruger curve?
Yeah. So I think you know, as time goes by, that just becomes clearer and clearer, and it's.
But you also have a model that your understanding increases that must be true for everyone else as well.
Yeah, it just it becomes you know, it just becomes less shameful. It just becomes more obviously true that there's stuff you don't know, and stuff. And people who. You have more and more experiences of people who know a lot betraying that they have some gaps.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's because I've been watching a lot of YouTube videos with Simon Baron-Cohen, the expert on autism. I finally remembered the example now, where he was going through some famous people who were probably autistic or had characteristics that we know about that are consistent with autism. And one of the famous examples he gave was Glenn Gould, who I'm a big fan of, the Canadian pianist who was very strange in a lot of ways, very atypical in a lot of ways, as part of his genius. But the video, Simon Baron-Cohen called him the famous jazz pianist.
Oh, right.
And Glenn Gould wasn't a jazz pianist.
I see, okay.
No, he was famous for playing Bach. He was a classical pianist. And there you go. Funny. So, you know, does that mean that Simon Baron-Cohen's an idiot and knows
fraud.
Nothing?
Yeah.
No.
No, I know what you mean.
You know, just you're allowed not to know things.
Yeah, that's that was a big thing. The first video of mine that got semi-popular was this Old English
interview with an Anglo-Saxon.
Yeah, exactly.
You in a sheet.
And my aim with it, not having any subscribers, well, not none whatsoever, but not having any number of subscribers at that point, my aim with it was to get across the idea that this was a normal language that people spoke, and it had, you know, contractions and even though we don't necessarily know what most of them were. And spoken Old English may have been very, very different from written Old English. There are some schools of thought that a lot of the changes characteristic of Middle English had probably happened quite a bit earlier and not shown up in writing. But obviously, I'd translated the whole script myself quite badly as far as grammar goes, and so there were these obvious massive holes in my grammatical understanding. And because I didn't have any subscribers at that point, I didn't feel any strong responsibility. Not that I realised I'd made a load of mistakes, but the responsibility of saying these aspects might be wrong. You know, this is supposed to achieve this aim.
Is that why you took it down for a while?
Yeah, exactly. I think, well, I just got very sort of embarrassed about it, and also I didn't want people to watch it. And I think I've now resolved that nobody is trying to learn Old English by watching that video, and that there are much better resources for that, and I've got a big disclaimer on it now. But a load of teachers sort of reached out and said, can you put it back up, please, because I've been playing it to people in lessons and stuff just as a you know, listen how different old English sounded to modern English.
And the main reason that I'm interrupting you.
Oh no,
the main reason that you made it is valid, even if there are some mistakes there, and because you said that you wanted to show that it was a real spoken language, but of course that applies to all languages.
Yeah,
it applies to Latin and you know, whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
And that we've chatted about this in the past. That desire to, or just thinking about what was it really like? What was it really like when people spoke Anglo-Saxon? What was it really like when people spoke whatever it might be? And how did people really behave 1,000 years ago, 2,000, 10,000? And that's one of the things that I like about those videos, you know, when people upscale them. They upscale the old, very old films, and so that you see people moving and walking around
at normal speed,
naturally. In that authentic, I mean, obviously it does involve, you know, inference and filling in gaps and imaginatively, in a sense, in the technology. But those things, they just blow me away. Just this seeing that people walk the same.
Yeah.
I'm sure there were lots and lots of habits that were different, but and if you could suddenly go back in a time machine, you'd notice. I mean, presumably everything would smell differently.
Yeah.
But seeing that people, you know, scratch their noses the same way and cough and laugh and sort of stare at strange cameras and just cross the street, or somebody's late hurrying and they're just moving. Oh, they're just like us. It's so easy to form that impression from old, low quality, early films, you know, that people moved around in a jerky, speeded up way.
Yeah.
And they didn't, you know.
I think that's one of the cases where the interpolation is actively, definitely helpful, because even though frames have been added to make it 60 FPS and stuff, there's such a strong sense of distance when you see someone moving at, you know, slightly faster than they should be with weird judders and stuff. Like you can see, it's obvious from the video that they actually walk naturally, but it only becomes obvious when you interpolate it. And it's, you know, I suppose what I'm trying to say is the fact that they walked like that, like normally, like you can see in the upscaled versions, is definitely not fake, because that must be quite accurate to, you know, the interpolation's only doing so much.
They're quite low-level interpolations.
Yeah, it's not as if it's made up from nothing, which you could accuse certain aspects of accent reconstructions on this channel, especially the intonation is made up from nothing, because there's, well, as far as I know, there's barely anything on internet. You might be able to make some inferences, but it's just not, you know, whether there are obvious systematic ways in which intonation changes that hold true across languages. You know, that triangulation isn't possible, at least with the methods that we have at the moment. So that's something where it could have been completely different to the way it is in the reconstructions, whereas the walking is obviously not.
It's and you can get that with, I mean, another thing that you're interested in that's, I think, quite unusual and special on your channel is doing this with fairly recent stuff. I mean, stuff that's like definitely within my lifetime.
Yeah.
I mean, another thing I was blown away by was Get Back.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, because that's, I mean, I was at primary school when that was all happening. You know, just watching it, seeing, and just thinking, well, what was I literally doing at that very moment that they're saying that? What class was I in at primary school?
I think I'll be leaving the band now.
When?
Now.
And the fact that, you know, I knew perfectly well who the Beatles were, and they were local here because I'm a Merseysider. So this, you know, sense of being blessed by these 4, apostles or angels that kind of descended from above and were just so universally liked, feeling just the fact that they meant so much to me and us back then, and then to have it brought to life in this incredibly present way.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it's just I watched it all the way through, and definitely going to watch it again.
I'll just check how we're doing on battery. Yeah, sorry, carry on.
No, I was just talking about the Beatles Get Back. I mean, also, what's so uncanny, well, many things are, but the fact that it mostly takes place in unusual spaces, film studios or rooms, music. I mean, if that's your world, then you'd say, oh, okay, if all of that would look different now. But in general, they're just in rooms, not of the type that we spend most of our time in, like music studio rooms or film studios. And because they're, pop stars, they're wearing they've got their own crazy hair and their own crazy facial hair and their own crazy clothes, which, okay, is dated, can be seen as dated in a way, but, I mean, rock stars don't wear usual stuff. So given that they're unusual people and they're in unusual settings, it just makes it feels like it could be last week. It's only when they go outside
on the roof
that you really go, oh my God, it really was a long time ago.
Yeah.
Because with the digital wizardry, the Peter Jackson stuff, it just seems like last week. And
I wonder if sometimes when I watch stuff from the first decade of the 2000s, I often worry that if I were to try and make a film set then, I wouldn't get it right, because my memories have been so, you don't sit there thinking, what phrases don't people say yet? So that it's hard to remember.
Well, maybe you do. I mean, to some extent.
Yeah, I suppose now. I think I do now. Probably you do as well. But
I mean, I wrote a terrible screenplay. I mean, fiction screenplay
I'm
years
sure
ago.
It wasn't terrible.
You're welcome to read it if you want to. I think you'll find it is terrible.
I'd be quite interested to read it, but
I wouldn't dare. I mean, maybe I haven't read it for decades. Maybe I wonder what I'd think if I. Yeah, it's already a historical object now.
Imagine I put the pinned comment in 2 weeks saying, it was terrible.
Yes, no. Please do. Which is set in 1951, or was set in. I wrote it in the 90s. God, see, I think of that as recently. Time. But it was set in 1951, and in terms of the way people talk, I felt fairly confident about it because I was deliberately making the young characters in it sound like my parents.
Right.
I had my parents to go on.
Yeah.
Because they were the age of my parents. And it's set where I was from. So, but yeah, I mean, certainly at my age now, I can watch these historical films set at times during my life.
Yeah.
And so often you think, oh God, no, that's not right. And sometimes it just seems great. I mean, something that seemed great to me was Stranger Things, because Stranger Things is set in the States, obviously, but at exactly the time I was doing my PhD in the States.
Right.
And to me, it's like it was filmed then. I mean, of course, I was foreign, so maybe a real American would be better able than me to pick up on things they got wrong. But overall, to me, it feels like being taken back.
That I'm very glad to. It's nice to, because I've asked, obviously from much longer ago, but I've asked my grandfather sometimes, this programme that's set in the 1940s in rural northern England, how does it seem ridiculous to you that the filmmakers would think this is how things were, or is it about right? And he'd sometimes say, oh, that obviously that's not right, but this one seems all right. And I don't know if you've seen Saltburn.
Actually, I haven't. No, I must, because it gets referred to so much. It's so culturally
I think it's
significant.
I won't spoil it for you, but I think it's really the way it conjures up emotion. I think is incredible. And
I
it's
actually watched the beginning. But I didn't.
Yeah, the little
I've seen
montage
about
at the beginning.
No, I've seen about the first half hour and then
Okay.
got interrupted, and I just I need to go back and finish it off.
I really like it. I mean, you might disagree when you watch it, but it's set in 2006, and I think I gather that it was the director's kind of nostalgia, a little bit, a sort of nostalgia piece, a little bit, but it seemed weirdly modern to me for something set in 2006, and then I just realised that was because I wasn't going to clubs and wasn't living a student life in 2006. I was just a little kid sitting at home watching Doctor Who, so I didn't realise to what extent, if you were a student in 2006, say, it'd probably be very similar to if you were a student in 2020. Well, not 2020, 2019, let's say, and yeah, I think because most of my experience of that time is either people who were older than their 20s or people who were children, seeing, a depiction of what it was like for people who were about 20, I found there was a weird gap in my own knowledge or a weird gap in my own experience.
Yeah, I think is it common that we tend to think of the past as having been more formal all the time, which of course in some ways is true. Yeah, like all those people writing letters to each other, with these complicated sentences and long words that people wouldn't
use in
unless
conversation.
their will self wouldn't.
Unless they're what, sorry?
Will self.
Oh, I don't know who that is. But
have I got the name right? Cut it out if I've got his name wrong. The novelist.
I may just be too uncultured to know who it is.
I just suddenly had that weird sort of feeling of the camera and just going, hang on, is my memory functioning correctly?
We can.
I need to get
edit
my
it
phone
anyway.
out and check that.
But you can if you want.
Yeah.
But why does he do things in a very formal kind of way?
Well, the guy I'm thinking of is famous for showing off with long words.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Fairly famous for that.
I always liked, this is going off on a bit of a tangent, but I always liked Dickens. I can't remember any of the stories really, but I always liked the way that Dickens played around with long words and very, very elaborate sentences. I've heard it said that he did it because he was paid by the word for these serial news, but I'm not sure if that's true or if that's one of those actually facts from the internet or something. But I sort of playing around with language in that way, in a way that's obviously people certainly wouldn't talk the way that his prose was written, between the dialogue. I don't know how accurate the dialogue was.
Yeah.
But it's just that's one thing I've thought about a lot, the way that to a reader at the time that would just be taken as, obviously that's part of that's a literary convention or something he's doing. It's not supposed to be naturalistic because everyone knows what people are really like. This is just an interesting encapsulation of a story, whereas from my perspective, looking back, it's like watching an old film, and I'm like, to what extent is this film convention? And to what extent is it real?
We can't know, really, can we? But if you were Dickens, living in Dickens's time, if he walked through London, he was going to hear lots of ordinary speech. Yeah. Inevitably, and he'd be communicating with his social inferiors some of the time, etc. So. And so I think it's possible that he would have been quite aware of just the gulf between some ways of expressing yourself and the kind of style that he adopted as a novelist.
Right.
So, yeah.
He certainly played around with it and with sort of different
I'm thinking
styles.
of Jane Austen. You see, I remember when I finally got round to reading Pride and Prejudice, I remember being shocked that I laughed out loud on page 1. You know, I wasn't expecting it to be as funny as it was. But it's so hard to be sure if the jokes are working the same way now that they did. But I got the impression, reading Jane Austen, that a lot of the humour is playing against the formality, against the manners, against the politeness, and by extension against the prose style that she was using.
Like it's funny because of the contrast.
Yeah.
Yeah. I always wonder if that was true of Shakespeare as well.
Well, in Shakespeare, it's easier to see how that could be the case, because obviously people were not just talking to each other in blank verse all the time.
Yeah. I watched. Hang on, it's just occurred to me. Am I in frame?
Who cares about you?
Yeah, that's true. But yeah, I don't know if you ever saw, there was a film based on a play called Charles III, which was released in the mid-2010s.
Right, I haven't seen it.
It was, are you aware of it? It was...
Vaguely.
Yeah, it was, the idea was it was set after the Queen died, which was in the future at that point, and it was taking the vague characters of the royal family, doing what Shakespeare had presumably done with all of the sort of historical figures he wrote about, and just taking them as characters and doing something that wasn't necessarily realistic to the real people, but well, in Shakespeare's case, obviously he was loosely basing it on historical events, but it was set around this future historical event of King Charles refusing royal assent on some bill around the freedom of the press or something. He wanted to give the press more freedom, and the bill wanted to restrict it, and then starting like a borderline civil war kind of situation, like a massive constitutional crisis. And it was obviously, oh sorry, I spat on you there.
Oh.
It was obviously a bit overplayed for the drama, but it was written in blank verse, but with.
I feel bad for missing it now.
No, I mean I only found it because it was just on ITV Player or something by accident.
Do you know who wrote it?
I can't remember, but I'll put the name on screen. But it was written in blank verse, but in a modern way. So it played around with the convention of the sort of verse, the blank verse, and then also randomly throwing in very modern, informal things to say at comedic moments.
Yeah.
I don't know enough about Shakespeare to know whether it's an accurate modern version of what he was doing, but it's certainly powerful if it is.
And it's, I mean, you were talking about Saltburn and thinking, oh well, it might be more accurate than my immediate gut reaction was. But I mean, people do make mistakes. They do get things wrong, and films set in the relatively recent past, like my lifetime, if I can call that relatively recent.
I think you can.
I notice these things, and of course it's possible that I'm wrong, but I hear people using these verbal tropes, and there's no irony involved. It's just that the writer is either assuming that people used a particular expression at that time, which I feel I know they didn't. Or just doesn't care. Just thinks, oh, maybe they wouldn't say that back then, but I don't care. It's a movie. And then, of course, there's always the possibility that I'm wrong, and that it was being used earlier than I kind of think it was. But I wish I could give you a great example. I should have some great examples stored up. But I can't think of one. But it's things like people. Making a movie set, say in the 60s or earlier than, and having characters say things like "no way," I don't think people were saying.
Yeah,
I don't know when "no way" came in, but it
doesn't feel right.